Alright, so today we're going to be covering progression schemes and whether they have a place in a hypertrophy-oriented training program. So I want to cover what the typical go-to progression method is for most bodybuilders, and I want to cover these other progressions that you might see in people that care more about strength or power, and if they actually have a place in hypertrophy training like a lot of people do say. So I'm kind of going to be playing devil's advocate for my main method of progression that you see me use. This is what I prescribe to my clients 90+% of the time, and this is what I see most successful hypertrophy lifters do. So basically, to start off, do progression schemes have a place in hypertrophy training? The first thing I'd say here is that double progression is king. There are multiple ways to go about double progression. You can do a more static type where you wait for all of your sets to hit a certain rep target and then that is your green light to go up in weight. You can go more based on the first set, which is what I typically do. Let's say you're training in the 8 to 10 range. Once your first set with a given weight hits 10 reps, you bump the weight up for all sets. You can even go a little bit more aggressive with adding weight and go more based on the rep floor. Again, if your range is 8 to 10 and you're using 100 pounds, once all three of your sets are at 8 or higher reps, at that point you could add weight that following week. Again, that's a little bit more aggressive, but I do like to use that method in certain cases. So ultimately, double progression, in my opinion, is king, and there's a few reasons for this. The main reason here is that it allows you to prioritize intensity at the expense of progression and structure. And I don't mean at the expense of progression overall. I mean a more structured progression, to clarify what I meant by that. So today, I'll be playing devil's advocate on double progression, which is the most popular progression scheme for hypertrophy and is my personal favorite. What is double progression? Double progression is when you get a free hoodie for spending $99 or more on the Barbell Apparel website. Check the link in my description to see my entire collection, everything I wear in my videos, including the beautiful Frontier flannel you see me wearing here. Double progression is where you allow your intensity to dictate your progression and your rate of growth to dictate your progression. So it allows you to train as intense as you want because you're not restricted by a pre-planned out scheme. Let's say in a case where you are trying to do, say, a 5x5 for the most basic example, you are keeping reps in the tank on set 1 so you can achieve 5 reps on the later sets, on sets 4 and 5. That holds you back. A double progression would allow you to do as many reps as you can, training to your desired proximity to failure, so your desired intensity on set 1, and it accounts for a rep drop-off in the subsequent sets as you start to fatigue. So it allows you to equate your proximity to failure rather than you equating your reps, which ultimately, in the case of hypertrophy, are going to be somewhat arbitrary. It is intensity in activating the big muscle fibers that actually gets your muscles to grow. So it might sound like this has no place in hypertrophy training, but as I go on today, you might see that it actually does in some cases. So that is what double progression is, and that is the main benefit of it. That's the reason that people use it. Double progression is king, but it is a double-edged sword as well. It maximizes intensity at the expense of structure. And ultimately, the main downside, and really the only downside to a double progression, is it lacks structure. And I'll talk about mostly how this is a little bit detrimental psychologically, and a little bit about how it is potentially detrimental physically, but I think those are much more minor in the grand scheme of things. So I would say double progression is king. However, always having to anticipate the unknown can be pretty taxing mentally, and your moments of doubt will be exposed through progressive overload anxiety. So what I mean by this is whenever you're going into a workout, or even just to be more specific, a set within that workout on a specific lift, you don't know what's going to come. You have an idea of how strong you are, but you're always having to wonder if that +1 or that PR that you're so desperately chasing is behind the curtain of that upcoming set. And that can be pretty taxing mentally compared to if you just knew you had to go in and do 4 sets of 8 and all you have to do is complete that and your work is cut out for you. Those are much different in terms of how draining that can be psychologically, because one just pushes so much anticipation into you and you're so worried, you're so worked up and concerned about what the future holds, because we like structure, we like to have routine and anticipate things. And as great as double progression is from a physical perspective, that is exhausting and it's very daunting psychologically. So you have to be able to kind of either accept that and deal with it, and you can absolutely be successful that way. That's the way I train, and it's worked really well for me. But I can't lie and say it's been super easy psychologically, because it will take advantage of you in your moments of weakness, which are inevitable. So you have to kind of be prepared for that at certain times. And the tough part about that is it's hard to prepare for it, because when it occurs is when you're not actually paying attention. That's kind of the downside with double progression, I would say. Progressive overload anxiety, to continue on this, it's a parasite to the mind of a confident lifter. And it can introduce self-doubt, which leads to a bunch of other negative things in your training. So this is where you get into issues with, let's say you're chasing double progression, and on paper, at first glance, everything seems perfect. How could you possibly mess this up? And then a few months later, you might be running into nagging injuries, perceived plateaus, and your training just might feel like a real legit grind. And it's going to at times, but sometimes it's a little bit self-inflicted. And I'll cover a few of these here that you might run into, and I'd argue are almost inevitable for most people. Progressive overload anxiety leads to an imbalance in perceived strength to muscle gain ratio. And I'll touch more on how pre-planned progression schemes actually kind of counter that, and how they kind of mask and almost override and occupy your brain in the meantime as progress actually occurs. But what I mean by this is that since you're always waiting for that +1, or you're always waiting to add a few pounds to a lift, it's easy to almost think that that's going to happen every single time. So you go into every set hoping for a PR, and if you just match reps, let alone if the weight moved a little bit easier, or your last rep looked a little cleaner, or you had more controlled eccentrics, you're worried about just adding a rep or adding weight every single set you do. And guess what? That's not sustainable. I've already made a video on rates of progression and how skewed they are and how warped they are in the fitness industry as a whole, but I don't want to spend this whole video talking about that, but I think it's incredibly important. So if you haven't seen my video, what was it called? Progressive overload standards are out of control. That's what it was called. Go watch that video if you're confused on rates of progression, and please just play around with an online strength calculator. Just type in like rep max or 1 rep max calculator. Just look at a couple of the top ones that show up, and it will blow your mind when you actually look into it. I do it live in that video too, so if you're not sure what to type in or whatnot, that video will be pretty helpful if you're not sure about just overall rates of progression, which I'd argue most people aren't sure about anyways. And it's kind of unknown, so you're never going to know for certain, but you should have an idea of what type of progression you can expect. So with a double progression, you are always basically the ratio of what should be happening and what you think should be happening, it gets very skewed, and it's very easy to think that you should be progressing in the gym way faster. For example, if you were to add a rep to the top set of your bench once every 12 weeks, so about 4 reps per year, you're going to add, if I remember correctly, it was like 30 pounds or so to your 1 rep max in a given year. It might have been 40, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Either way, 1 rep every 12 weeks seems like nothing, and for 11 of those weeks, you would think you're in a plateau. At least most people would. But either way, go watch that video if you want more of an explanation on that. It's well worth it, and again, I don't want to waste this whole video talking about something I've already discussed before. So another thing here is progressive overload anxiety leads to, typically, a breakdown in your technique. This is an issue because you are sacrificing your technique, which is your stimulus, along with intensity, those two go together, in order to chase progression. Ultimately, this is just kind of, it's almost putting the cart before the horse, or perceiving the outcome to be, you're chasing the measure at the expense of the actual stimulus. Like, added reps are good when everything's going good from a stimulus perspective, because then that becomes a good measure. But when you chase the measure, you're kind of doing it at the expense of the stimulus. If you're just like, okay, well, if an added rep means that I'm growing, if I just bounce out of the bottom a little more, cut my range of motion a little bit, or cheat my technique a little bit more, or even just rest between reps towards the end of the set, I can add a rep and that means I'm progressing. No, that just means you made the lift easier so you can do a little bit more. So adding a rep ultimately doesn't mean anything if you're doing things differently. And sure, if you bring your 5 rep max on bench from 200 to 350, but you're cheating a little bit more. It's like, yeah, you still gained a ton of muscle in that process, but in the short term, that does start to become an issue. And ultimately, you're going to have to reset anyway, so it makes more sense to do it in the short term. So chasing progression, it doesn't make sense. You just have to take it when it's available to you. That's ultimately what you need to do. What you need to chase in order for progression to occur as a good measure is stimulus. That's intensity and technique combined. Your intensity is your potential for activating as many muscle fibers as you can, especially the big ones that grow. Your technique is the funnel that puts that into a productive set. If you're intense and your technique sucks, you're not really getting as much as you need, as much stimulus as you need towards the target muscle. So for example, if you're going all out on a set of pull-ups, but you're not paying attention to keeping your lats under tension and your traps and elbow flexors start to take over before your lats even hit failure, now you've got a decent set on kind of a funky lift for like your traps and your elbow flexors, but your lats probably still have a couple reps in the tank of good hard reps at the end of that set. So that's a good example of intensity without technique. And same goes on the other side of the same coin. If you're just technique with no intensity, you're setting yourself up to get a really good set in, but you're not actually doing anything with that. So ultimately, it's kind of meaningless. That's how I would describe that. Another one here, another side effect of progressive overload anxiety is you will have a very hard time tracking your, I'll just say accessory lifts. And I really dislike that term. The people that have been following my channel forever, you already know that, but I haven't talked about this in a while. An accessory lift is generally something that is viewed to as something inferior to, but could potentially help something more important. That's what an accessory is. So when you hear a power builder or a power lifter talk about an accessory lift, that is something that is outside of their peripheral vision, but it's still something that they will take care of in their program, but it's very much not in focus. So this would be something like a tricep push down, an overhead extension, a preacher curl, overhead press, things that might help their big three a little bit, but aren't ultimately of that much importance. So when you have those lifts in your program, progression is going to be slow. And the reason for that is because the increments we use to add weight are number oriented, not percentage oriented. They are based on just a number as far as like practicality goes. You're not going to be adding half-pound plates to each side of the barbell unless you are like an elite level power lifter in a competition. You're going to be adding the same 2.5 or 5 pound plates to the barbell on any lift, regardless of what ultimate percentage of the total load that next increment is going to be. So if you're doing a 20 pound, let's say you're a beginner, you're doing a 20 pound barbell curl. When you go up to that next increment of 30 pounds, that's a 50% total load increase. But if you're deadlifting 600 pounds and you add 10 pounds to it, that's a much smaller percentage. No, I'm not doing the math in my head, but it's a much smaller percentage. So you can kind of see the issues that might stem from that. Another one here. Did I write the same thing down twice? Yes. So ultimately, a bias. You'll develop a bias against those lighter lifts that take longer to progress. If you're just chasing that dopamine hit of being able to write down in your spreadsheet or your program that you added a rep or that you added weight, you will inherently become biased against lifts that you don't see progression in as frequently. So that's how people end up as power builders when they set out to be bodybuilders. They just get addicted to the progress, they get addicted to the measure of their lifts in the gym, but they don't get addicted to the way that their physique actually develops. And just to touch on the rates of muscle gain compared to the rates of strength gain, people think that you need to gain like insane amounts of strength and at an insane rate to be able to build muscle at a solid rate. But in reality, adding a little bit of muscle doesn't do all that much. It doesn't do all that much. Like if you were to add 5 pounds a week for a year, just do the math, that's kind of a lot. So adding 1 rep is a much bigger deal, and you should be much more proud of that than what the fitness industry would lead you to believe. It doesn't come from nothing unless you cheated your technique, obviously. But if you kept things pretty consistent and you add a rep, like that's a good amount of strength gain. Like that's making a difference to your projected 1 rep max for sure. People kind of almost assume that's like a baseline of progression adding a rep every single week, or even to all of your sets every single week, that is not like a baseline or a given or a default. Like that's really good progress. And adding a rep is a big deal, and I think we should start to acknowledge that. I'm kind of sick of these warped rates of progression that people expect to see. I'm not saying you can't progress fast, but a lot of the time, good, steady muscle growth that is more or less optimized doesn't lead to these crazy rates of strength gain. It still takes time. So stay patient, celebrate adding a rep, celebrate adding a little bit of weight. Those are much bigger deals and much bigger milestones than the fitness industry would lead you to believe. Trust me, I've been lifting for a decade. It is a slow grind. So it takes time. And I don't want you to get complacent. I want you to keep training hard, but understand that you're not going to be gaining reps and weight every single time you're in the gym. So don't get complacent, but don't get too greedy either. You want to strike that happy medium. So let's talk about a planned progression scheme here. A pre-planned progression scheme can put your mind at ease even if intensity is lower. So you are, again, you have to sacrifice intensity in most cases in order to properly execute something like a pre-planned progression scheme. So let's say you're doing something where you are doing like a volume progression over an 8-week block, where every 2 weeks you're adding a set, going up from 2 to say 4 or 5 sets by the end of that 8-week block. And let's say you're maintaining your reps. You could argue whether that's actually progression or not, since you're just changing the workload and not the performance, but ultimately you are doing a little bit more. So that is a fine way to add a little bit of size over time. It's not the best, but it is a method. Another good example here would be something like increasing your set count while decreasing your rep count. So say you start off a 4-week training block doing 3 sets of 8, then 4 sets of 6, 5 sets of 4, and then 6 total sets of 2. So ultimately what you're doing here is you are progressing the weight that you're using, and you're swapping that out for decreased reps, and then you're increasing your volume in the process. So these are all ways where you know what weight to use, you know how many sets to do, you know how many reps to do, and ultimately you're not going to be able to get perfectly to your desired proximity to failure every set, especially if your volume's a little bit higher for that lift and you're keeping that weight you're using static. But ultimately, you have your work cut out for you. You can follow that, and then assuming you're training hard enough to grow, then you can just keep adding weight each phase that you go through, depending on the outcome of the previous phase. So that can work quite well. Another thing here, one of the benefits of a pre-planned progression scheme is that your training is no longer indefinite. To expand on this a little bit, knowing that a current endeavor is temporary and there are opportunities to make changes in the future can help reduce program hopping or shiny object syndrome. What I mean by this is, if you're following a double progression, your training is very much indefinite. There is no structure, there is no routine aside from the actual workouts that you're doing. What I mean is, there's no calendar that you're basing your training off of aside from just the week in an indefinite sense. So if you are, say, doing a regular double progression like I do, and you're just repeating the same split over and over, again, like I said at the start of the video, this works excellent from a physical perspective, but mentally, when you feel like you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, it can be very tempting to feel like, oh, this is already kind of boring and I'm going to do this for as far as I can possibly see into the future. I feel like I want to change something. There isn't, say, like a deadline in 8 weeks where you have an opportunity to make a change and you can just focus on what you're doing at the very moment. So a lot of the time, changes within a program that is oriented around a double progression scheme across the board, quick impulse changes tend to happen at that very moment, where when you have something that is more structured around like a training phase or a block, or even just around the calendar year in a periodization sense, you can almost more easily focus on what you're doing at the given moment, because you know you have an opportunity to try something new later down the road. So you're not necessarily feeling as constricted or committed or locked into what you're doing, which on one hand can be almost a bad thing. But I'd say, when I'm playing devil's advocate in this case, if I am doing something that I don't enjoy a whole ton, but I wanted to see how the progress goes, knowing that I'm doing it for 8 weeks makes it much less daunting mentally than knowing I might be doing this forever and I could be subject to making impulsive decisions in my training at random times, and I might be more prone to program hopping. So it does put your mind at ease just a little bit. I would also say that it can work great when you are a higher stress person or a higher stress lifter. So if your lifestyle is very stressful, so say you are pretty high up at your job or you own a business and you just have a lot going on in your day-to-day life, you have a family, like all these kinds of things add in quite a bit of stress to your life. You're pretty much go, go, go. Very hard to get any downtime to kind of reset. I know if anybody's a little bit more introverted like myself, you need kind of that quiet time to like recharge a little bit. So having a pre-planned progression scheme and just spending overall less time worrying or anticipating what your training session might look like and just being able to go in there and execute your session as is written down, that can be a little bit more easy to do just from a psychological perspective. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, even if it's not the most optimal thing from a physical perspective. And ironically, one of the things that you want to manage the best that you can in lifting is you want to keep stress down. So if there's a way where you can just reduce stress, even if it is directly related to your training, you could make the case that having something that is exciting and easy and simple and planned and structured, even if it's slightly less optimal from a physical perspective, would actually result in being more optimal for growth when you get the benefits of reducing stress related to a program that does tend to be quite stressful with double progression. Another thing here, if you're strong and lifting puts more stress on your body as a whole, definitely beneficial to be able to regulate the amount of fatigue that you're getting. So for powerlifters, that's why you always see some type of block or some type of training phase planned out where they start submaximally and slowly work their way up. This can work fine in a bodybuilding context, but the one thing I would note here, if you're not too familiar with powerlifting or you don't really understand the difference, with powerlifting, you can tend to get away, and just gaining strength in like specifically lower reps in general, you can get away with training pretty submaximally because you can almost think of it more so as getting a touch on a heavy weight or just getting a feel for a heavy weight without pushing it as hard as you can. So you're not getting as much stimulus in terms of growth, but you're getting regular touches on heavier weights, and that can absolutely make you better in terms of the skill of lifting that given weight. So if you're taking someone that can bench, say 315 for 4 or 5, and you want to touch 315 every now and then for a single or double, that won't really fatigue you all that much, but you're going to be much more primed to be able to lift that in a future meet, or even if you just happen to max out at some point within your program anyways. So with bodybuilding, you want to get as much stimulus as you can. It doesn't really matter ultimately how good you are at handling a given weight. The weight is ultimately pretty arbitrary outside of the context of your progression as a whole. I would also say that for lifters that are high stress within their actual training, if you're somebody that's very prone to progressive overload anxiety, planning things out ahead of time can work wonders for you as well. I would still try and handle the progressive overload anxiety on its own before you resort to going to a changed program. But if you're just constantly dealing with this constant anxiety and stress about if you're progressing fast enough, or you find yourself constantly chasing that +1 when it's not there, going much heavier than you need to, and just feeling directionless overall, it can help to give your training more structure and improve your technique, which is still very important, because you aren't chasing that progress nearly as often, at the very least, as you would be in a double progression when you put that crazy amount of stress and anxiety on yourself. So I would say, yeah, it's more of a psychological issue, but just because you can overcome it doesn't mean you necessarily will at that given moment. And sometimes just trying something else can give you pretty good perspective into how double progression does work quite well anyways. And the last one here, if you're injury prone or have injury history and nagging pains, again, this is kind of similar to what I talked about with just people being pretty strong anyways. This is similar if you have like nagging pains or like a previous injury that you're dealing with. Planning things out to where you can start off submaximally and work up into a more maximal training intensity over a given phase, and rinsing and repeating, maybe working in deloads. This can work quite well too for just managing fatigue in general. So to finish up here, I did want to go over if these progression schemes are anything that's pre-planned out, is actually necessary from a physical perspective. I know I've talked a lot about the psychological here in relation to training, but from a physical perspective, in my opinion, it's usually not necessary. Double progression on its own doesn't necessarily stop working. That's a pretty common question I get is, when do you need to move on from double progression? When do you need to try something else? And there's really no training age where double progression is going to stop working, because you don't really just adapt so well and become that it doesn't become such a stale stimulus that nothing really happens. If you're putting a stimulus that gets you to grow in front of you and you're executing that, you're going to keep growing. Of course, there's other things that you might have to change, whether it's cleaning up technique, modifying intensity, changing your volume or frequency around. But ultimately, the progression scheme of a double progression, where it is more so a reflection of the progress you are making at the moment rather than something planned out and scheduled ahead of time, it just doesn't really, it just doesn't stop working, as simple as that. So progression does seem like it takes longer with a double progression, since pre-planned progression schemes have built-in quote-unquote progressions or just general lateral movements to keep your mind occupied while you wait for enough growth to occur to add a rep or weight. So an example of this would be if you're doing a double progression and you are maybe an intermediate lifter, or maybe you're more advanced, or you're just really anybody, beginner or early intermediate, doing a lift that's overall lighter, like an incline curl or an overhead extension. These lifts take a long time to add reps, and it's pretty normal to go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks without seeing a tangible change in terms of the numbers of your performance. You can still see kind of like the short-term intermittent increases in strength by things like you being able to repeat the same performance a little bit easier. Maybe your technique is cleaned up a little bit. Maybe your last rep is cleaner. Your eccentrics are more controlled. Things along the lines of that, but that's a little bit beside the point. If you follow a double progression, you're doing the same thing each time, and every time you're in the gym, you get an opportunity to test if you've built enough muscle to add performance, weight or reps. You always have that opportunity. You're always checking in on it. You're paranoid. You're like the person that's like waiting for an acceptance letter. I don't know why I couldn't think of the word acceptance. Like, think of an acceptance letter for like school or a new job or something. You're just like constantly refreshing your email. Sometimes just being able to step away from that, and then you come back a few days later and the email's there for the taking, that's a little bit easier than just like knowing the email is going to come in at the same time, but constantly checking and kind of refreshing your email 27 beforehand. So hopefully that analogy makes sense. But basically what I'm trying to say here in the context of training is, with a double progression, you are going to be, it's going to test your patience. You are going to be repeating the same performance a lot of the time, especially if you're more advanced, or especially for anybody doing a lift that's generally lighter, like an isolation or a more kind of stable, technique-focused compound lift. So that kind of stuff takes time. A progression scheme that's pre-planned out gives you an opportunity to occupy your mind with just more stimulus. And what happens here is, let's say you're doing something like a progression scheme, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, where you are ramping up the weight that you're using and the sets that you're doing with your rep count coming down. So say you're doing, just random example off the top of the head, week 1 you're doing 3 sets of 8 on bench press with 200 pounds. Week 2 you're doing 4 sets of 6 with 215. Week 3 you're doing 5 sets of 5 with 225. And week 4 you're doing 6 sets of 2 with 240. That feels like you're making progress in the meantime, but ultimately, and don't fact check those numbers since it's just an example, but those are just lateral moves. And what that's done to your brain is it's given you something to focus on for 4 weeks, where you got stimulus, 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 stimulus. You feel like you're changing something, you're progressing, and you're making good progress by doing that. And then at the end of that phase, let's say you add a rep to your previous 5 rep max. That is not because that specific progression scheme was the stimulus that you needed to add that rep. It's just because it forced you to be patient and wait 4 or 5 weeks to be able to add that rep. If you're doing a double progression, I guarantee most of us would say, oh, this is 4 weeks in a row and I haven't added a rep. I think I'm in a plateau. And then if you come back week 5 and add that rep, then ultimately the outcome is the same, but one basically just distracted you and gave you something else to focus on as you added a rep. So is that useful from a physical perspective? Maybe. I mean, there might be some benefit to just getting some different type of stimulus, whether it's like getting a touch on higher reps and then lower reps, and then higher volumes and lower volumes, and maybe you vary the lift or the tempo, or you add a pause. Like, those are all things that in theory could get you different types of stimulus or whatnot, but even if it did get a little bit, or say it doesn't at all, just having something mentally to focus on that gives you, say, something new and exciting to do each week, or it doesn't make you worry or check in on your progress, or even just it forces you to not go test that same weight for the same reps, trying to add a rep every single time, that can be quite beneficial. So physically, I would probably not say there's any direct benefit, but if you're in a plateau, like, sometimes you have to try things out and sometimes they do work. So I can't sit here and say there's definitely no benefits to a pre-planned progression scheme, but I don't think there's some type of magic. I think they're more so just like, here's something else to focus on while your progress occurs, and then we'll make that so it takes enough time to where when you come back and hit a +1, you feel happy about it and you never got stressed or anxious about adding reps in the meantime. So that is all I've got for today. I'm going to leave the video at that. If you have any questions or comments, definitely let me know. This is something I could make more videos on in the future. So if you have a specific question or video idea, let me know, and I will see you guys in the next one.